failed? The short answer to that question is that it was the only book I've read so far that provided me with a single actionable concept to follow. And the emphasis on single is pretty important because there's this notion called channel capacity, where the idea is that there's a limit to how much information that can be reliably transmitted to and handled by most of our brains. And then once you start going past that, well, the magic number being supposedly 7, we start to see a lot of messy things start to happen. You might begin procrastinating, you might experience decision paralysis, you might forget to do something really important. Yeah, all this kind of happens when you start hitting that 7 or beyond. But 7 is actually only a valid number if we're talking about one-dimensional tasks. For instance, memorizing a 7-digit phone number. Realistically, given that the nature of most of our tasks are actually multidimensional, that number should be brought down to like a 3. Because yeah, we all know that it's super mind-numbing to answer like an email and a Slack thread and like an Insta DM all at once. We can do it, but those aren't actually single-dimensional tasks. So related to this is another concept called task-specific tension. The idea here is that our brains don't like hanging tasks. They really want to close the loop if that happens. And so when you start organizing tomorrow today, what you're actually doing is deliberately setting up hanging tasks for yourself. And that means you wake up the next day with momentum, ready to close the loop on whatever tasks you've committed to undertaking. Yeah, so if OTT has worked with me where all other methods have failed, it's because there was just a very, very clear directive. The book had 8 concepts to offer, and from the beginning, they were like, just pick one. Just pick one and stick to it before moving on to the next. And the concept I picked was, of course, organize tomorrow today. All right, let me just move to the next slide. Yeah, so what does it mean to start organizing tomorrow today? Really, it just means to sit down once a day for 5 minutes and write down the 3 most important tasks that you need to accomplish by the end of the next day. And then you rewrite the most important of these 3 tasks at the bottom of your list. And this is what OTT refers to as your one must, but I like to be dramatic and I call it my do or die task. So while it can feel a little bit icky to mix your work and personal tasks together on a single list, you just have to accept that you've only got one body and one brain and one life, especially these days when everybody's working from home, like home life and work life tend to get pretty mixed up as it is. So you just have to accept that and just pick 3 tasks. It could be a mix of work or personal life, or only work or only personal life, whatever's the most important. 3 is 3, end of story. The other thing to note here is that urgent is not the same thing as important. So you actually want to pick your 3 most important tasks. So how do you decide what's important? There's a pretty good framework for this. Basically, you have to ask yourself, what happens if you don't do the thing in question? More often than not, urgency is just a lot of smoke. But sometimes things can be pretty important and urgent, in which case that's great. You know what goes to the top of your list. And yeah, you can just sort in terms of priority. But yeah, ask yourself, what happens if I don't do the thing that I say I want to do? Yeah, it'll tell you if it's important or not. So let's look at some examples of how I would have written a task before having read OTT and what they might look like after reading OTT. Before OTT, I would write a lot of fluffy things like work out or release the navbar updates or pay attention at town hall. And this sort of list can get very long. It could be like 20 items and there's no detail about any of them. But OTT is super clear about how to write a task. The task can and should be a specific component task that works as part of the whole. So what that breaks down to is you should write your task like this. Instead of saying work out, you would say follow a 30-minute yoga video or a yoga with Adrian video by 9 a.m. That's not to say that you don't have other workout items throughout your day, but like this is the one most important thing you tell yourself you want to handle, and it's like a component of the entire whole that is working out. Instead of just saying release the navbar updates, you might say sync with the team and request a peer review on those updates by 10 a.m. Inevitably, requesting a peer review will lead to you hopefully releasing those navbar updates. And it's a very actionable thing to do. Pay attention at town hall, that's pretty vague. How do you actually ensure that you do that? Well, you might say something like, hey, ask one question or provide at least one piece of feedback at the 11 a.m. town hall. And then at the bottom here in orange, you see that I've rewritten the single most important task on my list. And that's my do or die task. So sync with the team and request a peer review on our updates by 10 a.m. Yeah, so prioritizing your tasks is pretty important. Just because you have only 3 tasks on your OTT framework, that doesn't mean that other tasks don't exist. Things don't just magically disappear. And so for that reason, I keep a backlog of tasks. And then once I've done my OTT tasks, I move on to the other things. Yeah, so what you should actually not do though is push things off completely, because that would mean taking a complete loss. And if you get into the habit of taking losses on the things you plan to tackle, it results in a pile of hanging tasks, and that just leaves you feeling kind of not great, even if it's not super noticeable right away. So yeah, if possible, just try to do even the smallest fraction of whatever it is you promised yourself to tackle. So for instance, if something comes up and throws you off schedule, okay, then cut the yoga with Adrian video from 30 minutes and do a 15-minute one instead. Or if it's really bad, do a 1-minute stretch. Just whatever you do, don't get into the habit of taking a loss. Timing is another important factor in helping you avoid those losses. If you're pretty observant, you would have noticed that the examples I provided you with earlier were all time boxed, and they were pretty specific without being verbose. A lot of those examples were not even full sentences. The other thing you might have noticed is that all the tasks were specific to the morning. So there are a few reasons for this. One, time boxing helps because it forces you to be specific, since you can only accomplish so much in a given time. The reason why I put all my tasks in the morning is also because early wins are just great. They really help you in knocking those tasks out it really helps to knock those tasks out as early in the day as possible, because it just psychs you up to have a better day overall. The other thing is doing them in the morning helps you to actually accomplish them, because as the day progresses, there's more of a chance of things like blockers, emergencies, distractions popping up. So that's not to say you can't have OTT tasks for later in the day, but just challenge yourself to see what you can actually bump up to happen in the morning. You'd be really surprised by what you can do earlier than later. And also in relation to this, you should set out to organize tomorrow today earlier than later. So I like to do anytime between 11 and 3 p.m. because basically the longer you wait to organize tomorrow, it's less likely that you'll actually remember to do it or be bothered to do it. Because it's only 3 tasks, a lot of people might have the tendency to be like, oh, I'll remember it. That's not the point of this exercise. It's really to sit down, mindfully think about what I want to do and to set those hanging tasks in your brain. On that note, taking a page out of Glengarry Glen Ross, coffee is for closers. If you have not prepped tomorrow's Kool-Aid, you get no coffee today. And by that, I mean, just take 5 minutes of your day before your first coffee, or if that's too intense for you, then take 5 minutes before lunch. And organize tomorrow today. Make it like a little habit. Try to stick to it for 90 days. That's what the authors of OTT suggest, and see if it makes a difference. If you accidentally skip a day or two, oops, if you accidentally skip a day or two, you'll probably realize how helpful OTT is. And like right now, we're all sitting here acquiring the info and taking it in, but like understanding is not the same thing as doing. So yeah, just really give yourself that chance. 5 minutes a day for 90 days. Preferably by hand if you can, and try sharing it with other people. That way you can really affirm, that you're going to do what you set out to do. And well, get used to being a winner. And since we have a little bit of time left, I just thought that it might be nice for us to all give OTT a shot. So maybe we can just spend a couple minutes just writing down what our do or die task is. I won't ask you to plan out your entire 3 tasks for tomorrow, but I think we can all sit down and figure out what's the one thing we must do by tomorrow. And then afterwards, I'll just ask a few volunteers to share, and maybe we can workshop it on how to improve your task or determine if your task is important or not. do we need a few more minutes or is this good, do you think? You know? All right. Well, okay. I guess, yeah. Does anybody want to share what their do or die task is? You can raise your Zoom hand or whatever. Yep, Sae.
Yeah, so tomorrow we have a team sync with our product manager who would like an update on a particular feature that we're developing. And so and that is at 10 a.m. So I'm going to, at 9:30 to 10, I'm going to quickly draw up and outline what points I want to bring up to our product manager so that
Nice.
he is ready to listen.
Okay, so that's a pretty good task in that you've time boxed it. You're pretty clear on who you want to deliver your work to. Maybe one way to improve it or to make it just clearer to yourself, maybe just be like, okay, I don't know, 2 to 3 points or something like that. That way you have like a really actionable thing. And if you haven't done those, then you're slacking. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
No worries. Does anyone else want to share? Thought I saw a hand.
We do have bring birthday gift to neighbor by 3 p.m., which is very, very important.
That seems very important to me.
We don't want to miss that, you know?
Jolene, if you're willing to share with us, can I ask you what might happen if you don't do that?
If I don't do that, then it won't be his birthday anymore.
All right. And would it be problematic if you accidentally brought it over like the day after? Just playing devil's advocate here. Like, how offended would they be?
I don't think they'd be offended, but I've already confirmed that he'll be home that day, and so I'd have to reach out again to see if it would just cause more work, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So like, that's a pretty good gauge for like whether or not something's important. Like, is it going to cause a downhill effect? Having to reorganize, having to reach out to other people, that sucks up your time. So it seems like an important thing that you should do for the given time set. So yeah, great task. Anybody else? All right, cool. If you have any questions, comments, I guess now is also the time.
Yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but to the audience, please feel free to ask questions outside of the presentation. We'd love to just get to know each other here. So the speakers are graciously accepting of any kinds of questions, whether it's about themselves or our company. It's up to you for sure.
Well, I have a question. So, Althea, like, how long have you been doing this, and have there been days where you don't feel like any task is important enough? Like, is that okay to skip a day?
Yeah, so I've been doing this since January something. I actually wrote it down in the beginning of my slides, but I won't dig there now. But yeah, is it okay to skip a day? I feel like that one's controversial because the point is to make it a habit, and like studies have shown that you need to sort of stick to something for like whatever 3 months to really make it a habit. But I have skipped days and it doesn't feel good. Like, I can tell you, I noticed immediately that I got really lazy. Like, I stopped doing the things I set out to do, because in my head it's just like, yeah, of course I'll do it, but then I don't actually have this, I guess I don't have that task specific tension. I don't have that hanging loop. And so the problem with that is then it builds up. It's not just one day, it becomes 2 days, 3 days. And then I started getting like decision paralysis over like, oh no, what do I tackle first? And then procrastination was also a part of that, because it was like, okay, well, I don't want to tackle any of it. Yeah, so it wasn't great. Sorry, there were 2 parts to your question. What was the second part?
Yeah, no, that you kind of answered it. So I guess what you said made me think of a follow-up question. What's like the longest your list has ever been, and has that?
Yeah, so for OTT, you only write down 3. Like, yeah, you have like a backlog maybe, but for specifically for OTT to make it manageable, you just pick the 3 most important. So yeah, like of course in my day, I have like a bunch of stuff I need to do, but every day I need to triage and just decide, okay, tomorrow, these are the things I must tackle. So for instance, okay, let's say I have like a dentist appointment. Let's say that my dog suddenly got sick. I have a bunch of like random work things I need to hand in. From that list, I think that my dog being sick would suddenly become both important and urgent. So that would go to the top of the list. Dentist appointment seems pretty important because it's really hard to reschedule things these days. And then from the work stuff, I would triage, but I wouldn't put all the work things because inevitably things would get pushed off and that gets you into the habit of losing. And that's not good. Anything else?
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, cool. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Althea, and we really appreciate your talk. And in keeping in line with organizing our presentation today, we are going to move on to Andrew Kirkpatrick, who will talk to us about some myths around site reliability engineering and some cool facts and how to really get your foot in the door in that domain. So take it away, Andrew.
Thanks. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. All right. Windows. Okay. So how to get started with site reliability engineering? It's a question I've gotten from a few people in terms of sort of what do I actually do? How do you even get started on this path? What does your job actually even involve, just based on all the crazy things you read on the internet? So thought I'd dip into that a little bit in this talk. So let's just go over some statistics to start with. In terms of looking at the Stack Overflow developer survey, looking back to 2014, less than 5% of people disclosed themselves as female. In 2020, less than 8%. And in both of those years, less than 2% disclosed as like non-disclosure, so potentially non-binary. So for all intents and purposes, this is still a male-dominated industry. And just looking at a breakdown of engineering roles by gender that was done by Julia Silge, you can kind of see that there are certain distributions in favor, typically of men, but less of a distribution for certain roles, such as those which are more DevOpsy, so to speak. And if you look at those on a scatter graph of, say, last year's survey, you can see like the more you drift towards certain roles, the more kind of as a multiplier, the amount of male to female representation there is in certain roles within the industry. But zooming out even further from there, you'll see roles such as like a systems administrator or a DevOps specialist are around sort of 30 times or more male to female, which is crazy. I don't think it based on an already kind of male dominated industry. So like what's going on there? Something to touch upon before we go any further is sort of I'm throwing around a lot of terms saying things like DevOps and, you know, I'm an infrastructure engineer and I'm talking about site reliability engineering. A lot of these terms are used interchangeably and mean, honestly, completely different things to different companies. So you'll see these used interchangeably on job advertisements by recruiters. They can mean different things to different people. So that's just something to always bear in mind. So why is there such a gender imbalance? This is something that I tried to come up with an answer for and do a bit of research for this talk. But honestly, it's really difficult to figure out why that might be the case. I have my theories about it, and most of them really surround people not really knowing what it is that people like me and other people in my kind of role do. So taking this excerpt from an article online, on one end of the spectrum, there are back-end developers who focus on building infrastructure and automation tools, which is closer to, say, what I do day to day in my current role. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who do more traditional system administration work, Like they're the kind of people that are in tactical command centers for, huge enterprise corporations. They'll like defend from attacks, that kind of thing. So there's a wide spectrum of the roles and responsibilities that these types of people do. But ultimately, taking a cheesy quote from that article, DevOps itself is a philosophy before it's a job title. And that sounds rather abstract, but let's kind of dig more into a bit what I mean by that. First, let's debunk some myths. So a lot of common assumptions that people have about site reliability engineering and people in that field is, you must be an expert at everything. Like you must know Linux, like top to bottom. Like you must know everything about networking. Like AWS must be just like shopping on Amazon for you. But truthfully, like none of these things are really that core to what I do day to day. Like a lot of this is just kind of implementation details on these are specific things that I have specialities in. The same as anyone that does any job has specialities in kind of the tools of their trade. Honestly speaking, a lot of us have almost no idea what we're doing in most cases. And any kind of site reliability engineer worth their salt will admit that there are huge gaps in much of our knowledge. And some of that comes from just the sheer, overwhelming variety of tools, languages, frameworks, all this kind of stuff that's out there in the wild. It's impossible to know it all that well. So if that's the case, what are we actually really expected to know? Like if I don't know anything, what should I actually keep there in mind? A lot of this comes back to, I think, looking at what you're doing day to day, your company or your pet project or the group of people that you're working with, and kind of bring that to a context that you can relate to. So is the application that you're responsible for running well? Like what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of either the way your application is built or some of the ways that you do things, like your project management processes, like bug fix release processes, things like that. Knowing various alternative ways for doing certain things in terms of like, could I be deploying faster? Could I be deploying safer? Is there a cheaper place I could host my product? Are there different pieces of architecture that I can put in place to make it faster? This is kind of a quote that I feel represents what happens at a lot of SRE type conferences, is that shared suffering makes a team a team. So a lot, honestly, of how we develop and grow comes from outages and when websites go down. For a lot of people, that's not going to be something you can get access to, but like learning from people that have been in those kind of situations, I think will teach you a lot. Like say, if you can get access to postmortems or those kind of incidents that's at a company, or just even reading online, try and find out how these people manage to prevent some of these things from happening in the future. The how isn't important, but the why. What do I kind of mean like that? I mean that the core foundational concepts behind why DevOps is the way it is a lot less important than the actual specifics of how we do our job or the kind of things we look at. Kelsey Hightower is probably one of the most prolific figures in the development and adoption of Kubernetes. So kind of took this quote from him, in that not focusing on specific implementation details such as Kubernetes is the kind of thing that I think people should focus on to become more generally aware of how do we make applications safer to develop, easier to deploy, less bug-ridden, things like that. So I would recommend not actually learning any of these technologies specifically, but looking more at abstract concepts. So a lot of people worry that Kubernetes is the next big thing. I've got to learn how it uses. Like, why doesn't my company use it? It must be useless. Like not at all. Most people that run Kubernetes don't have any idea how it works. Like actually understanding containerization as a concept and like why the fundamental underpinnings of Kubernetes work is the more important thing. Same as AWS. It doesn't really matter if you don't know how to use AWS. It's more, why is cloud computing as a general concept useful? Like, why is it more useful than on-premise hardware? There's nothing wrong with getting started with hacky ways to do things. Like, whatever works for you, whatever is repeatable and safe is more important than, dare I say it, code quality in some of our circles. And database queues and caches can be your friends and worst enemies. So a lot of this stuff gets used and misused out there in the wild. So a lot of benefits that you get from doing things a certain way will also come with drawbacks that will potentially bite you. So what could you learn? Like, where do you start with all of this? Like I'm saying, let's learn some foundational concepts. What does that fall into? So there's too much to go into really in a talk this short, but I would kind of group a lot of things into kind of 4 core areas. So repeatability, observability, efficiency, and composure. So what do I mean by repeatability? Don't I mean automation? Like a lot of people will quote the phrase, you should automate all the things. But realistically, looking back from that, repeatability is just a byproduct of automation, meaning that being able to do something safely and reliably over and over again just typically comes from automating something, but it's not the be all and an end all. And a wise coworker said to me once, if you have to do it more than twice, write a script so you don't mess it up the third time. And spoiler alert, I did it manually the third time and took the site down. So as an example for like how you do this with deployment, a lot of people use the drag and drop sort of graphical user interfaces, right? So anyone that starts a pet project will just drag some files onto the server, upload it, does it work, good to go. And then going from there, you think, well, if I drag and drop it, that's kind of a pain in the butt. Why don't I like run a command to do this for me? And if I'm going to run a command or a bunch of commands, why don't I write a script to do it? And so on and so forth. But honestly, if you look at the code of a lot of the popular tools out there today, that's actually how a lot of them got built. That's fundamentally what a lot of them do. So like if you look at a vastly complicated tool like Kubernetes, those are the fundamental principles it's based upon. It's just if you have to do something over and over, make sure there's a safe and testable way to do it. Taking this quote from Charity Majors, if you're unaware, she's like a very high profile figure in site reliability engineering. As the CTO of Honeycomb, who runs an observability platform. And that if you're not automating things, there's a fair chance that a lot of the stuff that you do manually can go wrong from time to time, and you'll probably end up wasting, in the space of a few weeks, more time than you would have spent just managing to automate it, even in a basic sense. Observability. So this is kind of the typical workflow I go through in terms of like, what do I look for when there's problems? Like, is there anything in the logs? And all of the rest of the stuff essentially breaks down to how does my application perform in response to how it does normally? So like, how much CPU, memory, like hard disk space is it using? How fast is it? But none of these things really matter compared to like, how fast is it normally? Like how much does it use normally? And then downstream dependencies of that, like if this thing is fine, what about all the things that this depends on? So that's great and all, but how does that actually tie back to what my job role entails and what my employer asks of me? So this comes back to these kind of abstract terms, which is service level agreements, service level objectives, and service level indicators. Those mean almost nothing to most people. So in a real basic sense, a service level agreement is an agreement you have, say, with your customers. So say a lot of people quote availability in like 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines. And that breaks down to say 3 nines in this case is 99.9%. And that breaks down as say 43 minutes a month. So I've committed to my customers, my product will be good for this amount of time. In terms of a service level objective, say if you had different back-end and front-end development teams, you need to kind of break that down into objectives that they can actually meet. So back-end team, your API has to be up and available for that time. Front-end, like the user experience must not be broken for potential users for that. And that in itself is great, but how does that actually break down to something you can measure? And that's kind of one of the key tenets of DevOps is that this stuff has to be measurable. You need to know when you have or have not broken these agreements. So you use service level indicators. So each team would commit to say the API must respond in less than 5 seconds. Say let's decide on that as a timeout. It's got to be this fast that amount of the time. And say for a front end team, like there can't be so much stuff on the page and it can't be slow to render that people can't interact with it in less than 10 seconds, just as an example. And how do you measure this stuff? So any decent observability stack will capture this information. And there's really good free products that you can use to set up and tutorials all over the web. But the most important thing is to capture it so that you can then report on it and figure out how well you're doing from time to time. Efficiency. So in my mind, this generally breaks down as either a code problem or a process and people problem. So either your product is slow and you're not sure why, or when I develop this feature, because I've been asked to do it by my company, why can't I get it out to customers? Like, why is it failing testing? Or why do so many feature changes come up while I'm trying to get it out? So know your stack. I know this seems like kind of an obvious one, but a lot of people look to places like sort of Hacker News and other kind of websites online and go, like, I wish I was using this framework, or my language is terrible. I wish I was using this, or we're not using the best tools, or like we're using a really slow database. But I think a lot of people kind of overlook how much leverage you can actually get out of existing things, like using technologies 10, 15, 20 years old. There's a huge amount of legroom you probably have if you can figure out where those gaps are. So that's just where observability comes in to kind of dive down to this. Like use profiling tools that are available and figure out what can you solve at different parts in the stack to get more out of what you've got. Because the opportunity cost of switching to a different language, a different framework, as anyone that's tried to switch from say like Angular to Vue, like Flask to something else, can attest to, like it takes a lot of time. So breaking this down into say like a software development lifecycle, the DevOps research and assessment metrics, or DORA metrics, will typically break down with funky acronyms into, can you ship something quicker? Can you ship smaller changes more often? Like, can you fix bugs quicker? And can you detect bugs earlier in the cycle? So those like deployment frequency, mean lead time for changes, mean time to recover, and change failure rate kind of break down to day to day, how much turbulence are you creating? How many bugs are actually escaping? And how quickly can you resolve them when they crop up? If you look at this in terms of your actual process, like business processes as a whole, you can abstract this out to something called value stream mapping. So say if you get a feature request from a product manager, how long does each stage take from like initial requirements analysis, like development, testing, like putting branch feature deploys, all this kind of stuff? Like what points are you actually losing time? Like a lot of people just assume that it's always the development that takes a lot of the time, but in a bunch of cases, it's things like I can't get hold of the test environment to test my stuff on. Like I can't get someone to look at this because they're testing too many other things. So actually breaking it out like this and seeing where exactly you're losing time, you'd be surprised how many optimizations you could get from kind of looking at the human factors. Lastly, composure. So what if a deployment has just taken the site offline? Like all of this stuff that I'm talking about is great, but what if things are on fire and you're being screamed at? Honestly, the best way to learn how to firefight is to play with fire, as crazy as that sounds. But the best way to probably prepare for that is kind of get familiar with the things you're going to need to know when that happens. So like being comfortable on the command line is number one, especially if you have to SSH into servers, if you're in that type of environment, or if you're working with containers, like learning the kind of commands for how you can get logs out of them, how you can get into them and check things, how you can get basic metrics if they're not available from your monitoring system. So just kind of looking through some tutorials, getting kind of familiar with, this is how I get quick access to these things. If you can do that in the comfort of your own home, it's a lot easier to do it when things hit the fan. Knowing how to roll back and knowing when it's safe to roll back. Like I've come across plenty of people who have an instant knee-jerk reaction to roll back. Depending on your application, depending on database migrations, cache updates, it might not be safe to do so. And you can actually create more problems than it's worth by doing it without figuring out if it's actually safe to. And similarly, know when to ask for help if you're dealing with an issue that's causing absolute chaos, and know who to ask. So like dealing with something on your own at 3 a.m. in the morning, as I've done when I've been paged, like letting that kind of happen for 2 hours, like taking all that responsibility on yourself, on one hand might feel noble, but on the other hand, get the rest of your team involved, get other people involved and figure out who it's best to escalate to at those kind of times, but know that ahead of time because everyone gets panicked. It's a terrible experience to go through. So finding that stuff out ahead is really handy. Interviewing. So DevOps interviews are really tricky because they're not like a lot of other interviews. For example, coding tests are very rare, mainly because every kind of job that you go for will use a different language, different frameworks, like, different server operating systems, all that stuff. So it's very difficult to tie it down. But whiteboarding tests can be quite common in terms of from an architectural point, like if you had databases generically and queues and an application and this other application, a lot of interviews will typically be spoken through like that. As a result, a lot of the technology questions you'll get asked at that interview often will be related to the stack that they use. But bear in mind, conceptual answers should be valid. And so by that, I mean, try and relate your experiences as close as you can to the kind of things that you're asked, because there's a fair chance that you will have very limited to zero experience with exactly what they're asking you about. But if you've done similar things or tried to do similar things in your current job or even in a pet project, just try and sort of explain through I haven't done that, but this is kind of how I've approached these types of problems. And on the back of that, admit when you don't know how something works, because it can be very easy to be caught out and say I think this works like this, and this is, I've done this because I think this is a good idea, or just talking through things. It's a lot better to have a humility about it, I found, especially when interviewing candidates. Just sort of, most of us don't know how a lot of stuff works, and it's a lot easier, which I'll cover on my next slide, to sort of work with someone and tutor and mentor them if they're more kind of open to admitting where their knowledge gaps are. In terms of on-call, this is kind of one of the big ones. Of a lot of developers don't like being on call, and if you do site reliability engineering, you will be on call, and you will be expected to potentially wake up in the middle of the night. But really, you've got to find out, what does that actually look like? How often am I actually going to get woken up? Like, how often do you get woken up? Ask how many other people are on call with you. In particular, are there people outside of your team? You know, if it's just a rotation of 2 or 3 people, you're going to get paged a lot. But if it's a rotation of, say, 15 to 20 people, that load is kind of spread throughout. Your shifts are less regular, so it's a lot less of a burden on you. And ask how incidents are prioritized and what kind of resolution times there are for different levels of incidents. So, like, some places, especially really small startups, will expect you to fix things as soon as they go wrong. But the kind of bigger and more mature you go with companies, they'll have different priorities for, like, this is game changing, we've got to fix it now, versus this is inconvenient, you can fix it tomorrow morning, you can sleep. And that's really important. So should you consider it? You get an opportunity to learn a lot of things about some stuff that, say, as a front-end or back-end developer, you might otherwise not. But your work will be kind of less visible to stakeholders in terms of, you won't be releasing code that people get to play around with. It's mostly foundational things. Getting that root access, being able to do more dangerous things as part of your job, means there's more risk to it. Like, the chance of me being able to accidentally delete the production database is very real. That's just something to bear in mind. A lot of people are very keen to teach, myself included, but this is kind of what I mean by it takes the right mindset to learn. If you kind of accept that there's a huge amount of things that you need to learn, and that there's, you know, a lot of things you're not going to know, I think from people I've worked with in the past, it makes it a lot easier to kind of take to like learning and teaching those things. And a last point to kind of end on is, a lot of jobs just want rebranded system administrators. Like, they don't want people to actually fix their processes. They don't want to actually adopt any of this stuff as a philosophy. They don't want to make developers' lives easier or safer or make things go faster. They just want you to put out the fire and just continually put out the fire. A lot of them are willing to pay a lot to do that, but it will burn you out, and it's not fun. I can tell you from experience. So be careful is all I would say. So finishing up on this comic, getting root access is great. You get an awful lot of power, but with great power comes great responsibility. Anyway, that's enough from me. I probably talked for far too long, but in summary, learn why some of these things are a good idea to do, not the how, because the how varies too much for you to know everything. Start by analyzing and optimizing the tools, languages, and things that you're familiar with, and try and really dig down into like learning those inside out. Pick the tools that you find easiest to use. Like, don't worry about what other people are doing. Figure out how it's easy to do things for you, but just be aware of other ways of doing these things. Looking at the human factors can be really handy. Like, you'd be surprised how much time you lose, like, outside of your text editor, outside of the terminal. If you don't measure things, you'll have no idea whether you're actually improving or not. And that comes down to your application and also the human factors. And just be careful with some of the job opportunities out there at the moment. Like, people are desperate for people to do this kind of job, but it may come at a cost. And many people that I've spoken to, myself included, have been burnt by it. Anyways, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thanks, Andrew. We'll open up the floor for questions. I know we have one in the chat to start us off. So curious to know what the size of the SRE or DevOps team at PartnerStack is. Are there typically SRE interns?
So I was the first SRE hire at PartnerStack, and I did it by myself for about 6 months. And then we actually retrained someone internally to help out. I've been there a year, so the other 6 months. So I am to this date the only infrastructure hire that we've actually managed to get. And that's what I mean by it's a crazy competitive market at the moment. Like, trying to get hold of people is tough. And we have an open infrastructure engineer position at the moment. So I hope that helps. But yeah, I mean, the size of the team varies massively from company to company. I've worked in a team of 10, a team of 4, you know, a team of 1. So it depends on the size of the company, depends on the needs.
Yeah, from Sunitha, I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly, but asks, curious how you keep track of the code changes from the app dev team and how you collaborate with them to make sure they're designing features correctly for production.
So that can be kind of a difficult one. I would say there's no silver bullet solution to it, but one thing I think is education is probably the best way I've seen it done. Like I've worked at places that will have software architects that kind of act as like, you know, a knowledge guru, and will go around different teams and sort of point out like, don't do this like this, you know, you should be using this, or this is coming down the pipe. So I think there's different ways you could do that, sort of having internal like lunch and learn sessions, sharing materials like with other teams, like making people aware, like having front end, back end, DevOps, architecture type guilds or chapters. A lot of companies have to kind of make sure that that information is distributed. Having that happen either through just common collaboration with whoever's interested, or have it happen through engineering managers. It depends. You know, there's a lot of mechanisms to do it, but I think knowledge sharing is probably the key, because kind of I've found that when people try to enforce it and try to sort of like gatekeep people doing releases or gatekeep building features, you know, it's kind of not good for either party, because then I feel like I'm preventing you from doing your work and you feel like you're not being allowed to do your work, rather than empowering people so they feel like educated and inspired to do things a certain way, if that makes sense.
I have a question. So you did quickly touch on, you know, you kind of have to be on standby on kind of uncertain hours, not your typical 9-to-5 frame sometimes. How do you deal with that, or how often does that happen? I'm sure it varies from company to company, but and what made you willing to you know, deal with that as part of your contractual obligations? I'm sure other people would not want to do that. Just yeah, tell us more about that.
Oh, you mean being on call?
Yeah, being on call, you know, at uncertain hours.
I actually kind of got suckered into this. That's how I started it. So the last time I came to Toronto about 4 years ago, I was hired as an engineer, and then things happened and I got put in charge of the DevOps team. And then I was told that I would be put on call. That's how it all started. Honestly, I think it's the needs of the job, as much as that sucks. And different companies implement it differently. So in a kind of more holistic sense, you have proper service ownership. So different engineering teams, like as kind of like a full stack of, they own everything and they're responsible for everything kind of within their product that they manage. And all of them are then on call for that one particular product. That's probably the more ideal way to do it. But a lot of companies don't have the luxury of having, you know, like 80, 100 engineers and then breaking that down into, you know, like 10, 20 people rotations. So a lot of early stuff, you'll kind of get a handful of people and go, you know, the infrastructure the best. Like, you know, if the database goes wrong or if this goes wrong, you are the select few people that are going to know how to do it if it goes wrong at this time in the morning. So unfortunately, you'll have to deal with it. And sometimes they did handle that with compensation. So like at that job, I was compensated for every shift, on-call shift that I was on, but some of it's also going to be the culture of engineering. So I don't mind being on call, provided that when things go wrong, and at that company they went wrong frequently, is that stuff kind of filters back into product and you say, okay, this feature is unstable, or our usage of this database is not stable. Let's actually put some work in progress so that this gets fixed. Because otherwise you're essentially getting stung for problems that are ultimately never fixed, and you potentially don't have capacity to fix it yourself. So I think that's really important. I don't mind being woken up if I know that problem will hopefully get solved.
Very interesting. I like to always mention that my mom is the senior infrastructure engineer of my life. You know, she can relax for most of the time, but you know, when you know poo hits the fan, then she's gotta be on call, gotta take me to the hospital, and you know. Yeah, so we'll open up the floor for just any remaining questions. If not, we can move on to our final speaker.
I think there was
had a
one
question.
in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Oh, yes. Nareen asks, are there dev tools that you like to use? For example, Relay by Puppet?
I was actually looking at that quickly. I've not used Relay itself. I've used Puppet for a number of years. I hate it. I'm more of a fan of Ansible personally. But at PartnerStack, we're an entirely Kubernetes shop. So a lot of that is mostly a split between Terraform and Helm for managing things. But yeah, there's lots of tools out there. I have to look into Relay. I've heard it about, but I'm not actually sure how it works or how it differs from Puppet regularly or Puppet Bolt or Rundeck or anything like that. So, but yeah, that's kind of what I mean. There's so many tools. It's genuinely difficult to keep track of them all. And all of them have their pros and cons. But yeah, or having automation and being able to do things using infrastructure as code is also really important. Also, so you can have a standard like pull review process and approval process for code, same as any other development team.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciated your talk. And please reach out to Andrew if you have any further questions. Until then, let's move on to our final speaker, Katya, who is going to teach us a little bit about creative engineering.
Cool. Sweet. Let me just share my screen. Sweet. Cool. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about rethinking software development as a creative role. Before we dive in, a quick intro about myself. So I'm currently a software developer at PartnerStack, where if I had to guess, I would say I do maybe 96% front end. So very different from what Andrew does. Much more, I guess, on the design side of things. Definitely, sorry, switch slide. Definitely, yeah. Kind of can't get over the instant results. So I don't know. I'm probably far from infrastructure for now. But yeah, outside of PartnerStack, I'm really enjoying gardening these days. So I'm an aspiring ecological gardener. That picture is major goals. So hopefully one day I can have a garden that looks like that. But I kind of settled down and I realized that I'm not going to get there in 1 year. Also should probably use some of Al's tips because I get a little overwhelmed with garden planning. Anyways, so today I wanted to talk about creativity and what in the world that has to do with us software developers. So for a long time, I had this misconception of what creativity is. Creativity in my mind was closely related to being artistic. And I guess this is, maybe from our education systems or just in general, like growing up, no one really explained to me what being creative was. So in my mind, people who are creative are people like artists, musicians, maybe writers or fashion designers. For me, software developers didn't really fit in with this group of people because, we're kind of like maybe more described as analytical or like logic driven, right? Which doesn't really always fit in with like this other group of people. But it's crazy to reflect now on how like wrong I was about this. So my manager, Sarah, let me borrow this book called Creative Confidence. And back in the day when we could commute, I read this on the subway on my commute. And honestly, within like the first few pages, a whole new world opened in front of me. It was crazy. Like I was mind blown by how wrong I was. So what I learned is that creativity is not a personality trait. It's actually a process that can be learned by anyone and applied to any sort of problem, whether it's work, home, like, gardening, anything. And this really blew me away. And I love anything that's, you know, centered around like growth mindset. I find it super empowering to know that, you know, this is like, these are skills that you can learn and apply yourself. Like you don't have to be some like crazy genius, right? Like you can actually learn this and improve yourself, which I always find like super empowering. And so, yeah, so I guess, what does this have to do with us software developers? So this is kind of simple, right? Like our main bread and butter is to solve problems. And I think sometimes we have our heads like so deep in the code that we don't realize that these problems take on various different shapes, right? It could be building features, solving bugs, thinking about like infrastructure, how to improve like a platform, addressing tech debt, or like refactoring. At the core, these are all like problems that we're solving. And so because creativity is not a personality trait, it's actually a process for solving these problems. What I found is that applying creative thinking to problem solving as a software development has immense value. And kind of sort of, you know, honestly, this revelation happened quite recently, like maybe within the past 6 months, I've started like actually trying to like use this process to some problems. And I found that, you know, there's benefits such as I'm forced to learn and grow, because like as I actually look at the problems I'm facing, I take the time to step back and think about like what are my gaps in my knowledge and like where can I improve myself. I found that it's really helped me figure out where to actually start tackling a problem, especially a more complex one where you can feel, you know, like overwhelmed by the amount of information or the complexity and the amount of tools online. So it really helps me to get some sort of directions on where to start. It can also help to figure out like which is the best solution to pick for a problem, which can also feel like a little paralyzing sometimes, right? Like as Andrew was mentioning, there's like so many tools out there to do so many things, right? If you don't actually know like what you're solving, it can be really hard to figure out what solution and what tools to pick. And I've also found that it helps to actually drive value faster. So by using creative thinking, we can think of innovative solutions to problems that can actually get us to where we want to be faster. So honestly, now whenever I feel very overwhelmed by a problem, I try to think back to this process. And so the process that I've kind of been very loosely following is something like this. So the first step is to focus on the problem. I know this sounds like either silly or obvious, but it's actually really hard to do this, I find, at least for myself. This is because, you know, our brains are really great at developing connections and creating biases. If we see that, you know, someone online used solution X to solve this seemingly similar problem, I might just go and be like, okay, we just need to implement the solution and like, we're done, that's it. But by doing that, you actually might not realize that they have a different code base, they have a different organization, they have different conditions under which that solution was the best one for that problem they were solving. And that problem within our organization might actually be slightly different. So that same solution might not work exactly the same way. And so by taking a step back and focusing on the problem first, what that allows us to do is to challenge any biases that we have in our brains existing and assess the knowledge that we already have and experiences, and just start taking a step back. And to be honest, like if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, is that this is something that you can start doing with, you know, any sort of project you're working on, right? Whether it's, you know, I don't know, like you're renovating something at home or trying to learn a new skill, like think about like, what is the problem you're actually trying to solve? So the next step is to generate ideas for actually solving that problem. So in this step, you try to really push yourself to think outwards, right? So you try to think outside of your norm, and that might be challenging sometimes because we're so, you know, like so in the grain of things, like so used to thinking the same ways. So like going online or asking yourself questions like, you know, why don't we revisit this thing that we couldn't do a year ago? But why don't we actually reevaluate that solution now? Or, you know, what if we actually looked at the back end here or the front end or whatever you have it, but just pushing yourself and your team to think in different ways about that problem and how you can solve it in ways that you wouldn't like right away jump to. So essentially, like what I like to think about is the first solution that comes to mind, like just put it in your pocket and then like go try and find like 5 more solutions, right? So really just like, like some people don't like to say this, but go for like quantity versus quality, right? So just try to think about like what else is out there that I'm not seeing. And this is also an excellent step to actually consider reflecting on yourself, right? And if you can't come up with different ideas, take the time to learn about that space, because it might just be that, you know, you actually have some like gaps in your knowledge. And so this is an excellent time to actually go and, you know, talk to your coworkers, dive in online and think about what is missing there for you to be able to come up with different ideas. So the next step is to define your constraints. And the reason why we do this step after the idea generation phase is because in that phase, we want to keep it as broad and bias-free as possible. But in this case, we actually want to start narrowing in on like which solution should we pick, right? Which idea should we try out? And so listing out your constraints that are unique to you, your organization, your team are very key, right? So some things could be like tech debt or like time and effort. For instance, recently we were looking at like solving, you know, forms on the front end as a problem, right? And there, like we looked at, you know, libraries or like in-house solutions. And so like one of the things we looked at was what is the community support for some of these, right? Or like how good is the interface for some of these libraries? Another thing to consider is skill level, right? Like what is the skill level of the people on your team? Because that might really make an impact on what solution you pick. So the next step is to experiment and fail. And I love this one as well, because I feel like it's anything, again, like anything that's growth mindset, fail safe. I just love it because I feel like, especially, you know, like I also didn't start in software development and I always have imposter syndrome. So like anything that can help to, you know, help me feel more confident in my solutions or like decisions that I make as a developer, anything that can, you know, kind of minimize the risk, like always makes me feel better. So yeah, so this is essentially a step in which you can pick the solutions that based on your constraints and problem, you think will fit that problem the best or solve it the best. And then, you know, like make super low cost investments into actually trying out those solutions and seeing whether they solve that problem. And so we already do this, you know, through like proof of concepts or like spikes, like investigations. So there's really, you know, it's an awesome way to essentially reduce the risk of over investing in a certain solution without realizing like certain basically limitations of that solution. So the next step, which I copied from a gardening book, is to get a yield. And I love this step because I think, you know, with the whole creative process, some people, you know, might perceive it as like you have your head in the cloud or like, you know, you're just thinking about these things, but we're developers, like, you know, we work at a business. At the end of the day, we need to drive value, right? And so how do you narrow in on those different solutions and your problem, and how do you actually get a yield, aka bring value, right? And so I love this part because it really forces you to use your constraints, use your ideas, and pick the solution that gets you the most value for the least effort, right? So generally speaking, you will have a continuum of solutions. And if you plot them on like effort versus value, right, they might fall into different areas. Like something might be like amazing, but it'll take the team like 6 months to do, right? Which maybe due to your constraint of, you know, we need to do this in a day, like that won't actually fly. So figure out like what are the leverage points that where you can start getting value incrementally. And this is not to say that, you know, you might still have that 6-month plan, but how can you start to iterate on solving this problem, right? And how can you start driving value like tomorrow, basically? And so the last step is to learn and iterate. I think this is also super important. So just figuring out like the solution that you picked, did it actually solve that problem that you had set out to solve? You know, like, do you need to go back to your ideas and like figure out like maybe if a different one fits it better? We actually did something recently where we tried to improve our test data setup, and we, went down all these different paths and did like small different POCs. And we ended up picking up like this very simple solution that, started bringing us value, but then we realized that, now there's these additional problems that we didn't actually anticipate that we now have to go and think about. And so it's kind of just like the cycle that you continuously do, right, and drive value each time. So now I just wanted to share a quick example of how we applied this process on our team. So earlier this year, we solved this performance bug where, a backend endpoint was taking too long to respond, and it was taking around like 12 seconds for some users to navigate between different routes in the app. And so just wanted to point out that we were so sure on the solution that we were going to take in this ticket that it was actually like spelled in the title of the ticket. We thought that we would definitely be optimizing the endpoints. But how we actually solved this ended up being completely different. And that's because we actually started off by just focusing on the problem and taking that, optimization solution and putting it in our pocket and like forgetting about it. So we reframed this as, the user is experiencing a 12-second load time navigating between pages. Like that's it. Like there's nothing in terms of solutions in there, right? So then what we did is we started digging into the problem and looking at the code and generating ideas. And so we realized we were calling a very expensive endpoint on every single route change. So that seemed like a very, lucrative thing to fix. We also looked at different ways that we could potentially optimize that expensive endpoint. So we really looked at a variety of different solutions, including actually like this past week, we started revisiting this problem again. And we actually found that, we could actually not block the UI with some calls. So there's definitely like a huge different amount of ways that we could solve this problem. So in this case, our constraints were actually effort because we were solving for a super edge case of like 1% of users on our platform. We didn't want to spend, weeks solving this. We just wanted something that was like a quick win. So for us in this case to experiment, it was pretty easy. We could, just change the route calls, those API calls on route change and see if the actual load time was reduced, which in this case it did. And so, but we got a yield by actually pushing that fix, which this is like the greatest example ever, but it was actually like a one-line fix plus some like changes to unit tests, and it brought down the load time from like 12 seconds to almost 0, which was pretty incredible. And yeah, so now like learning and iterating on this problem, as I mentioned, like last week, this was something from 6 months ago. It came back again. Now we know the problem much better. We know the code much better. We know the different solutions. Right away, we're like, hey, there's actually like more fixes we could do on the front end before even opening up the back end for, optimizing, and something that would take like a really long project to basically like refactor all of those expensive endpoints. Cool. So to summarize, we learned that creativity is not a personality trait. It's a process that can be learned by anyone and applied to absolutely any problem, whether it be software development, outside, life-wise, you name it, and it could be solved creatively. And honestly, like none of this is new either, right? Like there's a ton of different frameworks in design, such as design thinking, creative problem solving. There's like human-centered design, but I found that none of these methodologies focus on software development. So it's definitely, there's no reason that we can't borrow from them. It's just that they're not specifically made for software. And yeah, so I just wanted to leave off by saying that, again, creative thinking is not something that's going to take away from our productivity or make us go slower. It's actually a tool that's going to help us come up with more innovative solutions that will get us to where we want to be faster and in a more valuable way. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Katya. I think we really appreciated that story, especially. It was like a fairy tale for us. Yeah, so just hearing the comments here, yeah, simple fixes to seemingly tough problems. I mean, I've been there where there was a very seemingly tough problem, and I had actually poured over way too much time. Over engineering is a huge thing, right? And that actually caused a lot more can of bugs. So yeah, definitely simple fixes, and that requires more time, like you mentioned, just to think about it first. Really love the structure you shared. Yeah, it's a great presentation. Between all these talks, we have a lot of frameworks to organize and improve our day-to-day working. Thank you, everybody. Did you want to quickly share what tools you use as part of your process, Katya?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I guess, the good old like pen and paper if you can, or if you need to get started, just drawing stuff out. Definitely is great. I think someone mentioned Miro, which is basically like my best friend in life. I absolutely love Miro. I'm on it like every day. So yeah, I would say definitely Miro, just like due to the versatility of what you can do on there. But honestly, I think any tool that works for you is great.
And also getting a lot of buy-in and support from our direct managers in aiding us in this process is very important, I think. You don't get that all the time, but it's always great to have managers who are willing to be part of this, partake in this process. So,
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think even to that, like you could start doing it with like even small bugs and just like I think it's definitely like building that culture of innovation and experimentation, but even starting that yourself, right, with like the next ticket you get, just like taking a bit of time and then coming back to the team with like different solutions, right, and then like sharing those trade-offs and showing them the value that you can get from taking that step back, I think is immense value as well. Yeah.
Al.
Yeah, thanks, Katya. That was an awesome presentation. I just had one question about POCs or proof of concepts. I think I've seen this in the past where there's like a tendency to like start a proof of concept and then like get into this trap of, well, we've already sunk all the time into this one. So people kind of just give up on even thinking about other solutions, whether intentionally or not. How do you personally find that, and how do you avoid that trap?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like managing expectations, right? I think the point of a proof of concept is not, I guess in my mind, not necessarily to adopt something like specifically that, like one of those things, right? I think the point in my mind of a proof of concept is to basically like either disprove it, right? And I think disproving something is super valuable, right? And like, let's say if you took three days working on something, right, and you actually like hit the wall and you say like, hey, like we did this proof of concept, we found this and this and this, and like we actually can't go ahead with it, like because we need like these other 5 things. And I think being very clear with like why it's not going the way you expected, right? So maybe it's not solving that problem the way you expected it to, and like listing out those things clearly. I don't think there should be any sort of like guilt to dropping something. Like for instance, recently, like, on our team, we spent, I don't know, maybe like together, like a whole day, like on TypeScript, for instance, right? Like diving into it, like looking into it. And then we decided that, we're actually not ready to do this, right? And just saying like no and being comfortable with saying no to things, I think is definitely scary, because maybe there's an expectation of like, okay, well, the team already spent 2 days on this, like let's just go ahead with this. But then you have to think about the downstream costs, right? Like if you go ahead with that solution that's like maybe is not optimal off the get-go, like you're potentially tying up the entire team, the entire org into that solution, versus like just admitting that, okay, you know what, we learned a lot through those 3 days, like how can we share that knowledge, like through documentation, or like how do we action from here? But then like definitely, like if you feel like it's the wrong move to do, like you're gonna basically end up wasting even more time and resources.
Thanks.
Very well said. Very well said. Do we have any other remaining questions? Do the work now so you save time and effort later. Yeah, it's measure twice, cut once is something that I've always loved to go by. Yeah. Awesome. So if there are no other leftover questions, I'd like to thank Katya for her presentation, and I'd like to thank all our presenters for their presentations, and especially our audience. Thank you for just spending so much of your time with us tonight. We do have just some closing remarks slides. So Stella, if you wanted to share.
Sounds good. All right, so thank you so much for joining us. And this is the contact information for every speaker who've spared their time and shared their knowledge with us. So if you have any further questions, please direct it there. And we hope to see you next time. This is the short link for our Slack. And please be sure to check out PartnerStack's job openings as well. Thank you especially to Sae, because she has been involved in organizing this from start to finish and also kindly facilitated all of the conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for our other facilitators today who have just been in the process of creating this this event and just being part of this awesome organization. Please join the organization, the Slack channel. We're all there, so you can just reach out to us on Slack. And yeah, again, thank you, Stella, as well, and the audience again. Just cannot emphasize how much we appreciate your presence and the discussions we had tonight. So thank you so much, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good
Bye,
evening.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for coming.